Warning, this episode contains discussions of suicide. Listener discretion is strongly advised. Hello and welcome to the 42nd episode of Coffee and Cocktails. I'm your host, Dr. Ann Wand. This month, for our series on giving voice to the voiceless, we will be talking with anthropologist Dr. Alison Macdonald and secondary teacher Sally Dennehy, who will be discussing with us today about education exclusion and the effects it has on rural youth. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Jinx. As per usual, we'll start off by having you tell us what drink you were having for the show, followed by a little bit about yourself. Sally, would you like to start?
So I'm having a dirty coffee this morning. It's my second day of holiday. So
what's a dirty coffee? That sounds
so
good.
I've just got like a coffee liqueur added to my coffee
that's
this
fine.
morning.
I was thinking like dirt, like my son's version of coffee. Like
No, just like dirty fries, you add your cheese, dirty coffee.
That's not dirty, that's great. That's happy.
It's quite joyful this morning.
Yeah, and what liqueur do you have in your coffee, might I ask?
I would normally have Kahlua, but this morning it's coffee tequila because I have no Kahlua in the house. Yeah.
See, I would normally put Bailey's in there. That'd be mine.
Yeah, Bailey. I'm about to move, so I don't have.
So you don't have time for Bailey's.
No. Yeah, it's just not in the house.
You flock your hair back over your... Anyway. All right, cool. So yeah, Sally, tell us about yourself.
So I'm a teacher. I'm an English teacher in a secondary school. I've been teaching for about 17 years. I live in Somerset at the moment, but I'm about to move to London to carry on my so hence why I don't have much in the house at the moment. So that's basically me. But I really love research as well.
Oh, awesome. And Alison, tell us about yourself and what you're drinking, obviously.
Oh, yeah. I'm drinking a really straightforward, boring coffee.
Oh my.
Yeah.
But it's in a pretty mug.
Yeah, I have a nice mug.
I like how it's blurred, like it has bad words on it.
I don't know why it's blurred. It's because my background's blurred, so it's like, yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, I'm drinking a regular coffee, but I'm enjoying it.
Good.
And so I am a social anthropologist. I work in the anthropology department at UCL, and I've been there for about 9 years. And yeah, my research more recently has focused on issues around education, and particularly kind of issues around equality, identity. And I worked previously on issues on exclusions, and now I'm working more on sort of progressive approaches to pedagogy in sort of different settings in the UK. So.
Okay, great. So I'm really glad that you guys, it seems like you guys have quite diverse backgrounds. However, you guys are both focusing on items that I think are quite important. If we could, before we sort of dive into the material, could you tell the listeners, firstly, how the two of you met and what got both of you involved in the concept of education exclusion?
So I'll go first. So as I said, I've been working as an anthropologist at UCL for about 9 years. And about, I don't know when it was, Sally, 2017?
Yeah, 2016, I think it was.
2016, Sally enrolled on our flagship master's program, MSc in Social and Cultural Anthropology. I was program lead at that time, program director, and I also was supervising Sally's individual dissertation. And Sally,
did she get a good grade? That's what I want to know.
I did.
It's all that money you've been paying her. Yeah.
Yeah. It was a good piece. It was an amazing piece of work. And Sally was doing her master's part-time, and we just kind of got on and got to know each other, and she wanted to do stuff in education, and I was moving towards doing stuff in education, and we just started chatting, and there was some funding that I'd identified to do an interdisciplinary collaborative piece of research on adolescence. It was a UCL Grand Challenges call for funding on adolescent lives. And I thought this would be the perfect opportunity for me to start kind of to seed a bigger kind of ambition that I had to work around education. And chatting with Sally, I was like, would you be up for working with me on the issues of exclusion? And yeah, it basically snowballed from there. And we've been friends.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, absolutely. It was exactly that. I was working, leading teaching and learning in a secondary school in Somerset, and I just saw that I was perpetuating problems I could see happening again and again, and I just wanted to do something a bit different. And so I decided to go and do this master's, and that's so that I was researching education while doing the master's, and I really wanted to look at exclusions and behaviour, but my actual research looked at something slightly different come the end. But it was great to be involved in these other projects along the way, like the Adolescents' Lives documentary that we produced, because it was just I felt it was really important to hear young people's voices in research, and I felt like that was something that was missing, that a lot of the education research was so statistical, and I wanted to bring alive the experience of what these young people were going through. And so that's what Alison and I worked on with this documentary, where the documentary itself was just about two young men, Andy and Mike, who were telling us about what happened for their permanent exclusion, and then how that had impacted their lives since, and how that impacted their sense of identity, their place in society. And so getting to know them over those few months was really powerful experience, and really proud of the documentary that they built at the end.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, so you guys, when you approached me initially, you were talking about, you talked about how you've been working on this several years on this idea of education exclusion. And I had no idea about this at all. And I would imagine that quite a few people who are listening right now have absolutely no idea what this is. How does this have to do with anything? Is it part of certain schools or all schools? So could you tell us listeners, especially those that have zero understanding who are hearing this terminology for the first time, what is permanent state school exclusion, and what sort of schools or people does that affect?
So in the most broadest sense, exclusion is the removal of a young person from their educational, or from their existing education, from their educational institution. Permanent exclusion is when a young person is removed permanently from the school roll, so they are no longer allowed to go to that school. And then the local authority must arrange full-time education for that child somewhere else. And this is a kind of countrywide government kind of policy. And a permanent exclusion is the most serious sanction that a school can give to a young person. And the Department for Education states that it should only be used as a kind of a last resort. It's worth noting that there are also other forms of exclusion. There's like temporary, or what is called a fixed period exclusion. And there's also internal exclusions that can actually happen within school. So, for example, the removal from a classroom. But for permanent exclusions, some of the most common reasons for why a young person might be excluded from their school is often what's called persistent disruptive behaviour. So that will be like that might present itself in many different kinds of ways. Acting up in class, it could involve being physically aggressive, assaulting an adult, assaulting another young person. There could be some verbal abuse, some behavior that's at risk to others, or indeed putting that young person at risk to themselves. So there's very different, very serious reasons as to why a young person might be excluded. Now, at the time of our research, which was sort of in 2018, permanent exclusions was a big thing in the UK media. They were actually on the rise. So after having dropped sort of in 2012, 2013, they started to actually rise again, to the point where I think the stat at that time was that 35 pupils a day were being permanently excluded from our schools, which is really shocking. So at the time of our research, there was this kind of serious concern lots of alarm about these kind of statistics. It's also important to say that exclusion, permanent exclusion, also disproportionately targets some young people over others. So, for example, research has shown that in some areas of the UK, the exclusion rate for Black Caribbean kids is 5 times higher than that of their white peers. And this makes them one of the, I think Black youth are one of the most excluded groups in the UK, apart from Gypsy and Traveller children. They're the most kind of excluded groups. So it's important to also realise that exclusion it disproportionately affects our young people. It's also that boys are more likely to be excluded. They're 3 times more likely to be excluded than girls. And there's a lot to be said also around that, which we probably won't have time to discuss today. But also young people on free school meals, they're also more likely to be excluded. So there's lots of intersectional factors that actually impact the risk or increase the risk of permanent exclusion. And it's also that our young people have really complex needs, and that there are lots of vulnerabilities that can intersect with one another as well. So, for example, young people who are growing up in poverty have family problems. There might be parental mental health issues. There might be some forms of neglect, some forms of abuse. There are also undiagnosed learning needs. There are mental health issues. There are increasing numbers of children with these complex needs. And research has also shown that the most vulnerable are the ones who are getting excluded from our schools. So, this is the kind of the sort of the broader context to what permanent exclusion is and how more broadly it affects young people. And I think Sally can say more about the rural context in particular.
Yeah, I was just going to add to the idea of permanent exclusion. Obviously, you've got this notion like this: a kid will do something wrong or persistently do something wrong, and then they're permanently excluded from the school. But there's more ways now that schools do that. So there's things like off-rolling, where a family might be encouraged to take on a homeschooling. It might suit their family more, but without actually really working out whether that is the best thing for that particular family. But it means then the school is no longer responsible for that young person's behaviour and well-being, and they won't then count against their results either, which is quite crucial in a factor in a school. But also there's things like managed transfers, or just making arrangements with schools in the area, so you move that child around with the notion of a fresh start being a helpful thing. But if the support network isn't put in place, that instability can make things worse. So when we talk about permanent exclusions, it's not just the big ticket numbers that you see in the press. It can also include lots of other methods that are being used in schools now to address these issues as they arise.
And these are, Sally said, these are largely invisible. So actually the statistics that you see in the press are actually probably incredibly underrepresentative or not actually showing the full scale of what's actually going on in our schools.
Yeah.
And I think it might be worth, for people who, again, are listening to this for the first time. You think about the disruptions that come with just having to navigate, from the parental perspective, having to navigate, your work or whatever your schedules are, and then making sure your kids go to school or what have you. And then if the kids isn't doing well in school and then suddenly has to leave, then that's going to also have a rippling effect on the dynamics of the family in terms of, well, where is my kid going to go during the day? And if, the alternative option, which we'll discuss in a second, might be a bit further away from where the parents are used to. I would imagine that also plays a big part, because you want to create this opportunity for the kids, but it might not necessarily work for the parents, I would imagine. Yes.
Absolutely. That's definitely a big problem. We'll come on to that in terms of a rural context in a minute, but it's even if it's not that much further away, they might have siblings still at the original school. So now you've got multiple settings, plus, you kind of know everyone in that community, and you've now got to restart again, getting to know people at perhaps a really vulnerable time in your life, like your child is not functioning and settled at school. So for whatever reason, that's going to bring stress and worry into your life, aside from the fact that those problems might start at home as well. There might be, whatever it might be, economic issues, sickness, whatever it might be, that's already complicating life in the beginning.
Yeah. And, it's interesting. Again, I'm always thinking of, when a new topic comes to me, it's like there are images in my head of what I assume something is. And I always find that ends up not being the case at all. And when I hear of issues in school, and again, this is largely perpetuated by stereotypes, I had in my head, certain pockets of London where there might be high crime rates or whatever. And so in my head, I'm thinking this is a city issue. But in actuality, what we're here to talk about is this being a rural issue. So could you tell us about how this exclusion in schools has an effect on students in rural communities, especially those from working class backgrounds?
So I'm going to start with the working class bit, because for me, this isn't a working class issue. It is a socioeconomic issue. There is, poverty is a big factor in when and how people struggle to settle in school and the kind of things that happen. And there's obviously that's widely researched. But there's a lot of working class people that are economically stable. Some of them are quite wealthy. They live good lives. They've have secure families, secure social relationships. So it's not just an issue of class. And I feel sometimes we lump those things, economic issues, into class. But it is a rural issue. And, I'm a Somerset girl. I'm really proud and love my county a lot, but it is forgotten. So whenever you look up issues of exclusion, you're right. It's nearly always the research and the findings and the resources are always centred in cities. And then when you invite people to Somerset to think about education, everyone has this stereotype of a pastoral idyll, it's all like leafy and pretty, and we all live in villages, and it's all, everyone knows everyone. And it's not like that. And there's a lot of it that is, but for young people, there's nothing here. The town where I've currently been teaching, for a long time, it didn't even have a McDonald's in the town. There's nowhere to, for young people to go. There's no college in that town. There's no university nearby. There's no public transport. So when life falls apart or young people need to just occupy their time healthily, there's actually very little around. There's very few role models. There's nothing to show them what life can be elsewhere. But the same social things still crop up. We still have issues of crime, violence, drugs. So, we're still seeing some of those same behaviours, but we don't have the same resources to help them. And the young people feel forgotten. It was one of Mike's first words that he used when we were making the film, was this idea of being forgotten. And when I tell kids at school that I researched in London, they're like, well, why do you want to teach here? Why do you want to stay here? Nobody cares about this place, so like this idea of this, like just tiny little bubble of nothingness is quite a powerful one for the people who grow up here.
And I think also one of the things when we were making, so part of the research project, the kind of one of the main aims was to find ways to share the voice of young people who've been permanently excluded from school. And so we did that through making a kind of collaborative documentary, and Andy and Mike had a lot of control, in fact, all of the control over what was in the film, how it was portrayed. And one of the things that they honed in on was the idea of the bus stop. And they spoke constantly about how basically that was where they hung out. There was nowhere else to hang out but the bus stop. And they'd sit there, they'd drink shitty cider and smoke fags and just idle their time away. And it was often where that was the place they'd go when they were bunking off school as well. And it became this real kind of metaphorical kind of motif in the film, because it was this really quite run down, sad place, lonely place that just really kind of started to represent a lot of their experiences of education. And in fact, we actually got some graffiti. The lads wanted to sort of graffiti on it. And one of the things by the way, it was wash off graffiti. We weren't like going around Just like putting loads of graffiti around Somerset. Yeah, but they came up with this idea of using graffiti, which itself is often seen as like a socially deviant thing to do, right? Yeah, you graffiti stuff and it's like seen as sort of a bad thing to do, so kind of socially. But they used it to kind of play on that, and one of the things that Mike wrote was forgotten.
Yeah.
You know, because that's literally, they felt like that was it. There was nowhere else for them. There was no life chance. What aspiration could they have? What role model did they have? And they were just kicked out of school and left. And that was literally like where we kind of met them and picked up with them to make this film and kind of explore what happened next.
And it was ironic, we didn't have to stop filming for buses, even though we were at a bus stop. Like there's just, you know, so that became like this stagnant place. Is like a bus stop should be able to take you places. You should be able to go somewhere. And yet we were just there and nothing happened.
There was no bus at all on the days we filmed. No bus.
And we didn't have to stop once for some people waiting to get on a bus or because people were getting off the bus. Nobody else wandered by. We were just... Apart from one lorry in all the days, we didn't have any interruptions while we were at the bus stop.
No people really either. So no one really to like look, you know, to see what we were getting up to. With
being like, why are you graffitiing that? Instead they're like, go for it.
Yeah.
They could use a facelift.
Yeah. So, the one time we were like, there were some passers-by when we were filming kind of outside the school grounds. And they asked what we were doing. And I said, we're filming about young people excluded from school. And then the guy just started having a rant about how bad these kids were and how they all smoked down the alleyway near his house. And I was like, okay.
Can we interview you? Can we? Do you have a minute?
Exactly. So, yeah.
Yeah. Ugh, the irony. Well, I think if we could, so, I mean, there's a lot we can unpick from what you're saying. And, you know, maybe we can as this conversation continues. But when students get excluded from school, I didn't, you know, it's one of those things where it's like, what happens after that? You know, I grew up going to state schools in the US, if my accent wasn't abundantly clear, but, when I started working as a teacher, I worked at private schools. And I knew working in private schools that if a student was being difficult, and we did have one instance, I knew that student, I knew what the procedures were, because private school, you can kind of say, okay, this environment isn't working for you, it isn't working for the teachers, and it's not healthy for the other students around you. We'll put you in state education. I'm not saying it's the right decision, but that was the option I knew was available. But even looking back, if you're in state education, I'm not really sure what would happen if that didn't work for you. You might move to another school. I know that there are what we would call juvenile, it's for students that are like really violent, you know, juvenile delinquent centers, or what we would call juvies. But in terms of what the work that you do in state education, what would the step procedures be, and what sort of alternative provisions would be available for these students?
So, I mean, really briefly, alternative provision is an umbrella term that describes all the educational provision that falls outside of the mainstream. And it's where young people go who've been excluded from school or who are unable to attend mainstream education for other reasons. You know, it could be medical reasons, there could be mental health reasons. There's actually quite a lot of other educational provision that we have in the UK that actually not many people know about. Now, some of this provision is state maintained, and the sort of maybe the one that people are more familiar with is what's called a PRU, so a pupil referral unit. Now, up until recently, as I said, the AP sector and PRUs especially, I think, have had quite a bad reputation. They've kind of been shunned, as seen as like the underbelly of our education system. And there was a report that came out in, I think it was 2017, by the Education Committee, actually called Forgotten Children, that looked at the what they call the scandal of exclusions and the kind of the AP sector more generally. And what they identified was that this is a very unregulated system, unregulated sector. They struggle, it's heavily under-resourced. Teachers are working under incredible constraints and working with the most vulnerable young people in our society. So the AP sector, which is actually dealing with building emotional damage of our young people, dealing with complex needs, building trusting relationships, let alone teaching, is actually sort of quite shunned and seen as in some cases quite stigmatized. Now there is a lot of variation in the AP sector. So there are some some AP provisions that are really struggling, and it's very difficult to provide any level of teaching or care. They can be breeding grounds for criminal activity. But at the same time, we also have some alternative provisions that are where young people are thriving. And there are some PRUs, like the PRU that Andy and Mike went to, where they did actually get the care that they needed, and they were able to get on to some extent. So it's a very complex, very challenging, and very diverse sector at the moment. But that is basically where young people go when they've been excluded. They'll be sent to some kind of AP, a PRU, or something like that.
Yeah, I think it's really important to remember that these PRUs, like you're saying, that the experience that Andy and Mike had, for them, going there was the best thing for both of them. They both commented on that. They both were able to get GCSEs while they were there. They were both able to then go to college. The woman who supported them, who was like their main person, who was like, I guess, like a tutor role or a mentor role, attended their college interviews with them and supported them through that. And so like for them, like access to that alternative provision was extremely important and fundamental in a journey that helped them to get their feet back on the ground. So when they are good, they are great. Like they provide something really important that cannot be provided in a hectic, busy mainstream setting. So, that provision is just so good. And it reminds us that even if exclusion, the idea of an exclusion is a terrible thing, like something that can be really harmful in some ways, having access to alternative provisions to provide resources to meet needs is really important in that journey at times.
Yeah. I think first, this is honestly, it's phenomenal, but it also strikes me that and maybe this isn't an appropriate comparison, but when I think of people who are struggling in life, right, and they need the support systems that they need, a lot of times they might go to therapy, and that there are good therapists and there are people who shouldn't be therapists. And it strikes me that depending on where you live, what opportunities are available, what you can afford, that could determine whether or not you have a very positive experience and you get the support that you need, as opposed to some who might not be the most appropriate person to be going to for help and advice. Would you say?
Absolutely. And I think you're right to point out that there is an element of quality assurance that is needed, but also a lot of the time parents are not given a choice, or they're made to feel like they don't have a choice anyway. So they feel like, that this is the option, you've been given this pathway and you've already got it all wrong to this point. So I think there might be an element of communication breakdown there. But also I think sometimes, what it's like when like if you think about the counsellor analogy there, or the therapist analogy you're using there, sometimes they might be a great therapist, but they're not the right one for you. Right. It's not the right one for you. And that could definitely, like I know in the classroom, I'm a good teacher and I build relationships well, but there are some students that I'm just not the best English teacher for them. Like I know that, they thrive better in my colleague's classroom. And so if I remove the ego from that, like, oh, I want to be the best teacher ever, then immediately I can see how I can work as a team to provide the best support. And schools and APs should be in a team together in that same way. But also the provision needs to be personalised for young people's needs, for sure, because a child that is struggling is not necessarily struggling for the same reasons as the next child and isn't necessarily going to respond to the same things.
Yeah. I can remember some years ago, I was teaching year 8, 8th grade. That was fun. Love that, by the way. And I had a student who was doing his 3rd year in 8th grade. And he was 15, and most of the students, this was in Italy, usually about 12. And so already he had, there was that, and he was coming to class with not the best attitude, but totally understandable as to why. And then I come to find that I think his parents were in the middle of a divorce. Things at home weren't great. And it's exactly like you said, you can't take this personally. Like, as a teacher, one cannot take this personally. And I didn't. But I also knew instinctively, like, I can't teach 19 other kids if this one's got an attitude. And in that case, I ended up having him work with another teacher, or I would just say, you're going with this teacher right now, because I cannot. The 1 to 19 ratio is already a challenge, plus the language barrier. And then, and I think, I think for teachers as well, there's a emotional component that we have to try to balance, because I think from, watching this video, and maybe we can talk about that a little bit later on as well. I was hearing the stories about Andy and Mike and the issues they were facing, but I was also thinking about it from the teacher's perspective and all the stuff that they're dealing with, and everybody has their breaking point. And if the teachers don't feel like they have the support that they need, it doesn't take much after weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks to finally just snap and say, get out,
Yeah.
And I think that's challenging for everybody. It's not just the student, but there's so many different pieces involved in this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know Alison and I definitely don't want to demonize teachers, even though some of this can be quite critical of the school system. I work with people that are some of the hardest working people that I've ever worked with, and they deeply care about the well-being of young people. But you're right, you cannot provide for the needs of some students in a context where you're also trying to manage the learning of all students. And I mean, I can think of many occasions, like even since doing this research, where I feel like Andy and Mike really pushed me to learn about myself as a teacher and a mother and a friend, and the impact that I have on others. Even with everything that I've learned, I still find myself in a situation where I cannot meet those needs, and there's been a young girl that's been removed from my class in recent years, not just from my class, but her needs go beyond what I can provide in the classroom. And in the classroom, that presented with her being quite aggressive to me and to others. I mean, unbearably spiteful to other students, some of whom are quite vulnerable themselves, and some of whom who have learning needs, so they can't even process and interpret that spitefulness as something that's, about her pain. It's something that's, very damaging to them. So to manage that, I have to have her taken from my classroom. But what we need is a connected system. So when she's out of the classroom, I know that her needs are being picked up, because I saw her later in the day and she's so tearful, and I could feel her unhappiness weighing so heavily on her. So I know everything is a defense. Her behaviors are a defense mechanism, something trying to protect herself. But I cannot be there for her and teach English at GCSE level at the same time to a room full of people with their own diverse needs.
Yeah,
for sure.
I think that's fair.
Yeah. So it's not like asking teachers to become more skilled at identifying and empathizing, and asking, parents and our communities to come together to help vulnerable people. Might be critical of what we're doing, but it's not critical of the effort that people are putting in.
Yeah.
Like, everyone is working really hard, for sure.
It's about identifying like the breakdowns in the system and where the system isn't working, and seeing education not as isolated, but as part of and interlocked with much broader social and economic and political factors, right? So this is about zooming out and trying to understand exclusion, not as an educational issue, but a social one, and asking the questions, why are young people vulnerable in the first place? How can we meet the needs of our young people in a context of this current society that we're living in? What can we do that's going to help every individual flourish? And, exclusions is not the answer to that. Sending them to AP might work in some cases, but not in others. The system is not working as it currently stands. So what are we going to do? We're just going to carry on. We're just going to put our heads down and just keep going and say, okay, exclusions have gone down a bit. So therefore, the move towards more punitive, zero tolerance policies must be working. Actually, we are getting better behavior because we've got these more stringent behavior management policies. But if we go back to the young people and their needs and their vulnerabilities, those aren't going away just because you're being told that you can't take your blazer off, at all, ever in the school day. Like, those needs are still there. So what's going to happen to them? Like, it's going to come out somewhere because, we're humans, right? And we need to communicate, and our behavior is some form of communication, as Sally said. It's something underneath, something inside young people that has to come out because they're asking for help. And so how are we going to address that? And I think that is the criticism, in a sense, that we're maybe trying to make of the education system. So it's not directed at teachers who themselves are overwhelmed within this system, that it doesn't support them to do what they want to do, which is care for and teach young people.
Yeah. Yeah. And if we could kind of focus on that social element, and the issues that it creates long term. I know that you guys had talked about how there is a relation between education exclusion and social alienation. Could you talk about that a bit more, as well as, Alison, what you refer to as the exclusion to prison pipeline?
So if I start on the social alienation, it was something that really fascinated me before I went to UCL and did my research. And then it was very much mirrored through the things Andy and Mike spoke about. So I saw young people feeling disliked. Difficult, challenging students would often say things like, "That teacher hates me. That teacher hates me. I can't go into that classroom. The teacher hates me." Or, and I would see it like, I'd hear staff members saying things like, "I can't understand why those kids are hanging out together. He's got such a bad reputation, he's got such a bad egg, that it's going to drag that person down," things like that. And I've heard that ongoing over the years. So I was aware already of this, the ways that we isolate and alienate young people. From even at primary school, the naughty kid never gets invited to birthday parties. That just doesn't happen. You see people frozen out socially from a young age. So I was aware of that. And that was kind of like in the mix of this idea of engagement that I was interested in. But then Andy and Mike spoke about that really heavily. It was really really clear that from the moment in their lives where things started going a bit pear-shaped for them, for different reasons, along with all of the other young people that we spoke to, there were like different things that were going on in their lives that kind of meant that school stopped being a good fit, and they started to struggle, to the moment where they were excluded was several years, a long time. And during that time, they were deeply unhappy and they felt different in the classroom. The word obviously forgotten came up. They felt like they weren't like the other kids. I can't learn in that way. I'm not successful in that way. So they use language like that, showing that they just didn't feel connected. And the more they weren't at school through exclusion or through skiving, the less they felt connected as well. So then they became more disruptive. And they could see that in retrospect, like that journey of isolation, and they took so much pain from it, like they held so much pain from it. And they were really upset about things like what might seem like relatively small things. Once you've been excluded and you've moved on, you're at an alternative provision, you're taking your GCSEs with different young people, they still wanted to be part of their old school. So to come back to prom, to get to say goodbye with the people that were still their peers, and they hadn't been allowed. And that I hear that come up every year when it comes to prom. Why are we inviting those people? Should they be invited? I can't believe they even turned up. I hear staff saying things like that. And it's like, but this is really important because these are people that these students they've studied with for several years to this point, and it's not their fault life has gone wrong. Like, even though you might blame them for their own actions as part of it, like, it's still a path that they didn't choose. And so that social alienation really comes through in lots and lots and lots of small ways that come together to have a really big impact. And it has such a big impact on their self-esteem, their sense of self-worth,
and their sense of belonging.
The belonging is so...
If you think school is like where you go from the age of 4 till 18, that's where you develop a lot of your sense of self and who you are, your personhood. And so to be ripped from that and to feel alienated from that gives you a sense of, where do I belong? Who am I? Why am I not like them? Imagine being 15 and grappling with those kinds of questions while also grappling with the usual sort of 15-year-old adolescent things that we know, lots of our teenagers struggle with, as then having also other contextual vulnerabilities that might be feeding in, So it's a really insidious problem.
And it kind of taints the support that they're getting from the AP as well. Like, there might be a sense of needing a punishment for an act of violence or for bringing drugs onto school or whatever it might be. Not that was Andy and Mike's story. Theirs was more smoking, skiving, being silly in the classroom.
In quotations.
Like much lower level, but all the time kind of things. So even if there needs to be a punishment for an actual act, like, this is punishment that goes on forever and ever. You cannot come to prom. You cannot be part of this. You cannot celebrate these moments. Like, they're not just punished for the one act. They become punished as ongoing in many ways. Yeah.
As people, they feel that it informs their sense of self identity, of who they are. They take on this idea that, I'm an outsider. I'm a bad person. I don't belong here.
I was thinking about quite a few things when I was reading the material you guys sent over. I think sometimes there is this assumption. I mean, I grew up with this mentality drilled into me to just like get over it, which I've not always found the most easy approach to deal with things. But I will say that one thing I have noticed is that everybody, regardless of their mentality towards moving past things, has experiences when they were younger that have an effect in the present stage of their life.
Sure.
It could be something as comparative to these issues. It could be something like being embarrassed about a particular thing. Like, not to put my husband on a pedestal, but he is right now and he's not here to stop me. But he told me a story about how his dad had the most horrendous fashion sense. I never met him, but when he was alive, apparently he had a banana, like a canary banana suit that he liked, that he'd wear with a Union Jack tie. I mean, it was heinous. And he thought he looked good. And I'm like, whatever, man. Like, these pictures, he wouldn't just wear socks with, in Birkenstocks. He'd wear Union Jack socks with Birkenstocks and then go to Mallorca. Like, that was that level of like, hi, I am here. So fashion wasn't really his thing. And my husband was telling me about how he was in year 6 and he needed new shoes. And his parents, were on a budget. So his dad found these shoes that fit within the budget. And he goes, here you go, son. And they were girls' shoes. And my husband said, Dad, I can't wear these shoes. I'm going to get murdered. Like, there's no way I can wear these pink lined shoes. You don't understand. And his dad's line was, it doesn't need to be fashionable, just functional. And Richard was like, I beg to differ. So he goes to school in these girls' shoes and is teased mercilessly, comes home crying. He's absolutely devastated. And it was only when he saw the state of how upset his son was that his dad finally went grumble, grumble and got him some different shoes. And now that we have kids, my husband is adamant, like, we're going to get you shoes that are not going to get you bullied. And that's just like comparatively quite small, but in a 42-year-old man, he remembers that as clear as day. And so you think about these events where it's traumatic, how could you expect anyone to feel any differently, Which I think leads to this other idea of, this exclusion to prison pipeline. I mean, people don't just wake up to be difficult, quote unquote. There are reasons behind it. And so what sort of, if we look at worst case scenario, what kind of effects could this have on people long term?
So, I mean, yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, maybe to start with the school to prison pipeline, this is a term that was actually popularized in North America in the early 2000s by activists who were trying to describe a situation where there was a disproportionate number of youth incarceration, which was starting with the education system. And this was specifically about criminalization of Black youth, a disproportionate criminalization of Black youth. And actually, Damien Sojourner's work at the University of California, Irvine, looks at this issue in an incredibly inspiring and I think very thorough and rigorous way. And he has some really incredible insights to come out of that. So that's where the term came from. In the UK, it's also referred to sometimes as the PRU to prison pipeline. So some people might have come across it in that sense. And it is highlighting a similar phenomena, which is the link between young people who are excluded and their criminalization. And we know there is research that shows a correlation between these harsh zero tolerance policies, and an entry into criminal justice system. We know, for example, that majority of people of UK prisoners have been excluded from school. There was some research that came out of the Institute of Race Relations in 2000, which also showed that the proportion of pupils in PRUs and in AP has an overrepresentation of young boys, and this is in London. So we can see clearly that there is some alarming situation going on whereby there is a link between exclusion and criminalization. And what this is telling us is that we are failing our young people because we're not doing enough, first of all, to prevent exclusions in the first place. And when they are excluded, what's happening to them? And this is where it becomes a bigger social question as well. What's happening to these young people? They're just kind of left adrift. And getting involved in crime, getting involved in knife crime. And, we have 16, 17-year-old boys who are ending up in the criminal justice system in ways that could have been thoroughly prevented had we tried to think about, and it takes us back to these issues of needs and vulnerabilities and these intersectional issues of racism, things that we know are going on with our young people, things that we know are happening within our schools. The pipeline is really a phrase which I think is pointing to a much more complex problem within our society, of which educational exclusion is indeed just one part. But we also know that young people who are excluded from school are also more likely to suffer long-term mental health problems. They may not go to prison, but they may not have the levels of education required to do further education, to even get any GCSEs. They may not have basic literacy or numeracy. So they're being really, really failed in terms of on their education. They may be facing long-term unemployment. There may, also be issues around, using drugs, for example. And actually, for us, one of the reasons we wanted to come on and do this podcast is because we found out this year that Mike actually committed suicide. So this is not just exclusions are a really bad thing and they're messing people up. It's like, no, this is a matter of life and death, and our young people are being failed. And Mike isn't here now to tell his story. It's there in the documentary, but it's like, at what point do people need to stop and pause? What needs to happen for people to kind of start questioning? Because I feel like people don't question education in our country. It's just like, oh, this is what you do. You go to school, and you go to this school in your local authority, and it's just where you go. Unless you've got enough money to send your child to a private school, and then you have the luxury or the cultural capital, or not the cultural capital, but you have the choice, to send your child to the school that you want to. But otherwise, it's just something that you just do, and you just accept it, your fate. And then if your child's excluded, then you just accept the fate of where your child will go. You're given such little choice in the matter. And actually, it's like, isn't it time that we started to rethink how we're doing education? Everything's kind of pointing to that question. So yeah, that's kind of where we're at.
But I think like the exclusion to prison pipeline, those kind of words, and the way it's measured in schools encourages schools to minimize exclusions. And then that creates a twofold problem. One, it makes managing the classroom even more difficult if you're having to manage behavior you can't safely manage in the classroom. And that can be spitefulness, it can be violence, it can just be disruption, whatever. But it also, those young people, if you just don't exclude them, the problems don't go away, as we said earlier. Those vulnerabilities are still there. So we have to address this in a broader sense and just go than just simply, you cannot exclude kids from school. Like, that doesn't make anything better. There has to be something more than just that as a way. Like, I've worked with head teachers that have said things like, oh, we've not excluded someone for 6 years, or we've not done this for however long. But that doesn't mean no children with extreme vulnerabilities presenting in difficult behaviours haven't been in front of us. That's not true at all. I've seen that in almost every school I've worked in. So there has to be something to look at here. And I think, the exclusion to prison pipeline, you're right, is so emotive and powerful because it addresses this sense of fear, doesn't it? Like this idea of the criminal in our society that we haven't changed. But actually it's not. It's, like you say, Alison, like the mental health issues, and then the risk of suicide, the risk of addictions, the risk of so many other things that can destroy a young person's life. And, that for me, that just going back into school after hearing about Mike and realizing there's young people in front of me that could be on those pathways, and I've still not managed to change something. Is that brought it back to the forefront. There's still so much work to be done here.
And when you guys talk about the school system through these, as a result, these exclusion policies, you talk about how they seem to be self-fulfilling. I know you talked about quite a bit already, but could you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, I think we've touched on this already, and I think it's that our schools are social places. Our schools are social systems. They're impacted by cultural ideas, and indeed they replicate those and sustain those in many different ways. And I think one of the kind of cultures that we have within our schools is this idea of kind of good and bad children. And of course, people who work in schools and work with young people, we know that that's not necessarily black and white. But what came through with our research with Mike and Andy was that there is this morality of being a bad kid is something that you take on, and you're told so many times that you're naughty. You're told so many times, that you're trying to play up. There was one incident where I think Andy was saying, I don't know if he'd forgotten something in class that he should have, and his teacher was just like, "Oh, Andy, you do this every time. Typical Andy, you're just forgetting your book." And he's like, "No, I genuinely I didn't mean to," but because he'd been stereotyped as that kid, therefore he was that kid. And that then spirals into the internal exclusion. So you get kicked out the classroom, and then that spirals to, fixed term exclusions. And eventually it will lead to a permanent, potentially lead to a permanent exclusion. So it's as if our schools are kind of creating this kind of these two classes of citizens, as it was, those who will get their head down, knuckle down and kind of get on, which is no good thing necessarily, because those kids, being really compliant and obedient is not necessarily how we want our young people to thrive anyway. We want to be creating questioning, curious, critical thinkers, problem solvers. But we have these kids who are being, who are obedient to the punitive system and to the, very hierarchical systems that we have in school. And then you have the kids who can't meet that criteria. And research has shown that there are young people who fall outside of that criteria. They just get policed the whole time. And Andy describes school like a prison. He says it's where you go to be trained. They trained you like a dog. These are his words, right? So it's as though if you fall outside of that criteria, you then basically become to take on this kind of this idea that you are this bad kid. And that is lasting, like we said, previously. That then becomes your sense of who you are, and people carry that with them today. Like I know adults today who are excluded from school who still think they are bad people, So yes, I think that's the sense in which we're talking about it, in terms of the alienation, in terms of the breakdown of belonging, the lack of recognition of different learning needs, and that everybody has to fit this very stringent criteria. And if you don't, the answer to that is punitive measures.
Yeah. And that you're wrong in some way.
Yeah.
So like Mike said things like, I wasn't like the other kids, so I messed around. And Andy said things like, the school taught him, like, this is my bubble, be happy with your bubble. Whereas AP helped him find his creative side and showed him that the world was his for the taking. So there is a morality there, but within that, there's all the negatives, the social isolation, the social alienation, not being seen well by teachers and adults in your community. But you've also got the other side, like this idea of the teenage rebel that can then give them quite a lot of social influence, and it can be quite charming. So it ends up feeling like a safe space to be. It's easier and more fun to be the disruptive pupil. And that gives you back a bit of power instead of finding power in becoming, having the resources to help you over the problems that are there, whether it's a learning need or a social need or whatever. So yeah, the morality is definitely a problem, and that is created in a school context for sure.
And of course, that's also run through with like issues like gender and race,
Mm-hmm.
So we know that teachers have, unconscious bias towards black and brown students, right? We know that there is institutional racism in our schools. So if you are a black kid, you are more likely to experience these kind of stereotypes anyway, before we even get into maybe this morality of being a good and bad kid. These two things become even more interlocked and even more problematic. So it's a really complicated and really important issue that we need to think about. How can we create environments in which we're not labeling, in which we're not judging, in which we're not stereotyping, in which we're allowing people to express themselves in the ways in which they need to express themselves, that obviously in ways that are not harming others, but means that people can live in a community, in a compassionate and caring community.
Yeah, but I think you could also take this beyond education. I mean, you think of industry, okay? You think of micromanagers. I can say from personal experience, I left an institution that was very toxic. And unfortunately, I have colleagues that are still there that are trying to figure out how to get out. But when you talk about these feelings of feeling bad, I mean, you get this in work as well, where it's this idea that like, oh, you must be terrible because your managers have decided, they've told you you're terrible. And then you feel like, well, there's no point in me applying for other jobs because I'm so bad. I should be glad I even have this one. If I try to apply for another one, no one will even accept me. Not realizing you've basically been gaslighted and brainwashed to think that you're awful. And,
for sure.
I was fortunate in that I could see the red flags from the beginning. We had a spare income, so I could just leave and be like, bye. But my colleagues weren't in that position, and even now I remember I wrote one this morning because I am concerned about her mental well-being. She's in therapy now. She's got anxiety up the roof. And I know a lot of it has to do with this particular institution. And I said, I just want to remind you that you're a great person and you're doing great work. And she said, thank you for validating me, because right now I don't feel that. And so I think, if we can do anything, I think sometimes it's good to have comparisons, because there will be people listening who have no idea. They've never experienced this before, let's be honest. But I think everybody's had a really bad boss. Everybody's worked to some capacity in an environment that makes them question whether or not they're doing a good job. And I think if we can take that and say, okay, that's a taste of what to experience. Now imagine experiencing that from when you were a small child all the way up during the building blocks of who you are. You know, imagine how much more of an effect that's going to have on you long term, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's a good association. Like, and also you forget, don't you? So even if we did experience it at school, it's so long ago, we've kind of romanticized some of those memories, and we've populated our experiences with new ones at work. So you're right, like it is something that we can all identify with. I think that idea of a bad boss or a colleague that's really influential, that gaslights and makes you, destabilizes how you see yourself in that space, and how powerful that is, how it takes over your whole life. Like, you come home thinking about it of an evening, you start worrying all night about going into work the next day. You're right, you don't put yourself forward for promotion, but you probably don't promote your work day by day either.
And you probably don't put in your best effort because you feel like you're going to do terrible anyway, right?
Yeah. So it becomes self-fulfilling, like this, like,
exactly.
because you become totally disengaged and
uninspired.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, you guys have said that one of your long-term goals through the work that each of you do is to illuminate the violence of the educational system and the ways in which disruptive, quote unquote, young people are stereotyped and judged. Can you explain to us the ways in which you've gone about doing this, as well as explain to our listeners what causes these stereotypes to exist in the first place, even though I know we've kind of talked about this at length already?
Yeah, I think maybe we've said, we've kind of addressed like how these stereotypes exist in the first place. I think we use the term educational violence because we really want to highlight that what is happening in the educational system is experienced as violent. It is violent. You know, people might associate violence with it being physical, but actually violence can be emotional, violence can be mental, violence can be experienced in many different ways. And people are traumatized. You know, what happened to Mike, is violent. He committed suicide. And that is a legacy of his education that led him to that point. There were other factors indeed, but education was a part of that. So I think part of what we're trying to do is raise awareness of the fact that this is happening, and this is happening to young people that your kids might know, or the kid that's next door, or the kid that, you're passing in the street. This isn't something that's like shut away. This is something that affects all of us. This is about the young people of our country. This is about the next generation, who are going to be the next leaders, the next teachers, the doctors, bus drivers, whatever it is they're going to be. It's about raising this new generation. And the time is to change how we're doing that. The time is we think we need to radically rethink how we're doing that. So I suppose we've started on a journey together, Sally and I, even though Sally's been involved in education, obviously as a teacher for a lot longer than I have. But I suppose we're starting on a journey where we're trying to ask these questions and move towards having conversations and trying to support interventions that are going to make some kind of difference, and to start changing things.
Yeah, and I think the term educational violence is so powerful. Like I really like it as a term, and it really, for me, it started, like, and I can give you a really good example because I feel like I still perpetuate some of this violence too, which is why I think it's important. It's not about reminding, like, we're not demonizing schools and teachers. We're trying to think about how this is a lived experience.
Yeah.
So when I was leading teaching and learning, one of the things that I did as part of my job was do learning walks around the school, all the time, popping in and out of lessons and just seeing what was going on, not just the quality of teaching, which is what people tend to think of these experiences, but how kids are learning, what kids are doing in the room, how they're engaging in the lessons, and that kind of thing. You see a lot of patterns. And one of the things I saw was some kids that had the reputation for being challenging and difficult behaviours. They would turn up to a classroom, and these are all made up names, but it'd be like, hi Ella, come in, sit down. Oh Tom, here's your book bag. Oh Ben, such and such. And then it would be like, oh Mark, have you remembered your pen today? And just the tone shift in that voice, the teacher's voice, repeated lesson after lesson, day after day, or just became something that really informed an idea of being disliked and less worthy than the other students. So, you know, if we think about this through the lens of like feminism, we talk about everyday sexism and microaggressions. And I think that this is happening in our schools in the same way, and it informs those young people how to feel about themselves, because they already are not being treated like the other children in the room. And granted, from a teacher's perspective, I know from my experience, I've pre-prepared that kid's pen because he always forgets his pen, or she always forgets her homework, or whatever it might be. And so I'm preempting that, or I'm lining up my class because they're really noisy and those 3 children are really disruptive, so I don't let them in until they're silent. I know from my own experience, I carry on doing some of those things because I've got to get 34 kids out of my class and the next 34 in, and someone's going to be checking that my starter is pacey. And because of that disruption, we've not really secured the knowledge on this play yet, and that's going to come up in my review. So I'm trying to, you know, manage like 9,000 thoughts in my head at the same time. But the impact on those young people who are struggling already is that they feel like I care a little bit less about them than those other children. And so, you know, I try really hard to do things differently. I always have a pot of pens, they're there, and I try to make adjustments so that, you know, so everyone has access to these things. So I'm not singling anyone out, but I still can't be perfect at it. So, you know, a lot of work needs to be done, because I don't want young people turning up and feeling like they're not worthy of my time, or, you know, that I don't like them, because that's not true. I find very few teachers dislike students. You know, that's not the case. We're frustrated because we can't change something. We're anxious because our pen supplies run down and we've got none left, or whatever it might be. But the impact on that young person is most definitely violent and long lasting. It informs, you know, their sense, as we spoke about earlier, the sense of belonging, sense of self-worth, that has a lifelong effects. So I think, you know, it's a great term for that.
You know, and I find myself, you know, I think about some students that I had in the past, and I don't know if I would have handled myself differently, because I do think that, you know, if somebody's being disrespectful, like, it needs to be addressed. Like, if a student's being like blatantly rude to your face, like, it's not okay to be like, that's fine. Like, that's not okay. Yeah. But I do find myself thinking about, you know, the ways, especially when I was teaching in Italy, my language skills at the time were terrible. And I mean, I was dealing with culture shock. I was dealing with like a host of stuff. And then I was working at the school where there were no rules, apparently, because, you know, why have rules? That's silly. And really feeling like I needed to put my foot down. And I remember there was one student in particular, I think there were a few, don't get me wrong, but there was one in particular I was just thinking about. And I think he was quite used to getting very good grades. And it's not to say that he wasn't studious, but I think that it had gotten to a point where he thought he was smarter than me. And there was a definite clash there. A, because he wasn't, and B, it was causing tension in the classroom. And I think I remember at one point I just said, that's it, in the hallway. Like, I'm not having this right now. And he and another student got in trouble. And I told them off in the hallway. And I told them off in English. And the girl didn't understand what I was saying, but he did. And I said, you know, do you understand what I'm saying? And she's like, I could hear her going, I don't understand. He's like, just say yes. Just say yes. You know, so it's like, but I can, you know, looking back, I think there's always like that questioning, right? Like, did I do the right thing? Did I not do the right thing? And I think within teaching, it's just good to be reflexive. It's not to say that we haven't done the right thing, but just to be mindful with every decision that we make, you know, going forward. How do we learn from that? How do we make sure that we can separate ourselves if possible? I think it's just a good exercise in life, you know?
Yeah, definitely.
Teaching.
Yeah. I think that reminds me of a recent thing. I had a student this year who I really struggled to keep in the classroom. Like, and he definitely, it falls under the category that I was talking about a minute ago, that he felt I did not like him. So then he would be really defensive and disruptive from the outset of the lesson. And this typically went in a cycle that happened again and again and again, where he'd have to be removed from the room using our behaviour policy. And, his behaviours were inappropriate in the classroom, but I couldn't get beyond it. I couldn't find a way to rebuild that relationship. My timetable was so heavy, I couldn't get and see him at other times to kind of try and find ways to rebuild that relationship. So it was difficult times. And I was speaking to one of my colleagues who I do some coaching with, and talking about this and saying, I felt like I'd really let him down and I wasn't being a very good teacher for him. And it was a really important bit of work that we were trying to get through. And she just stopped me and she looked at me and she said, but you are a good teacher because you care to talk about this. Like, you might not be working with him, but don't worry, there's nearly 1,000 students here. So, that's fine. That's why we work together. But you are being good because you are prepared to try new things, to talk about it and to talk about the things that you feel aren't working. Right. So it is really powerful to do that. Because all too often we try and, especially in education, you want to showcase the best bits. And I know that from my research, that teachers would hide the bits they didn't want seen, like the books they haven't marked yet or whatever. And so it is about making us feel secure to talk about the things that aren't working, because it's not a criticism, it's about finding solutions, isn't it? So
yeah, absolutely. Could you guys tell us what does inclusive education look like now that we've talked about exclusive education, and how it would benefit vulnerable students?
Well, when I was thinking about this, I mean, there's Alison can go into a lot more of the research, and I know that she's been doing some recently, but schools already have a lot of tools at their disposal, and there's some really great work going on. It's just a lot of it turns tokenistic because there isn't time. So, for example, something like using restorative justice rather than just punitive measures can mean a chance to rebuild relationships, to help young people learn to empathize, to learn to understand the impact of their behaviors and their choices. It can help them learn how to manage their emotions so they're not just acting out of anger. That can be really powerful. But if you're trying to squeeze it into 2 minutes in your break time, when you also need to go to the loo, grab a drink and open your resources for the next lesson, then you're not giving it the time that it needs. And so from my experience in mainstream at the moment, that's the biggest lack, is there's just not enough time and resources to do the things that we know work, and when they do work are powerful. But I've just got a job in a new school that does things very differently, does give a lot of time to those things. So I'm really excited to start that pathway in September, hence why I'm moving to London, because there isn't anything like this here in Somerset, sadly. So hence why I'm moving.
But I think also just to follow on from that. So recently, having had my experience of researching with Andy and Mike and others, and I do want to sort of look for potential solutions. So my new research is working on sort of what's called progressive education, more kind of radical forms of education, what's often called sort of democratic education. And what I've been learning in that space is that it's a question of reframing how we kind of set up the structures and relationships within our schools. I'm an anthropologist, so I see people as in relation. We are always in relations to others. And of course, we know that we live our relations, all the time. We have parents, siblings, friends, colleagues, all the rest of it, teachers, pupils. But the ways in which we structure those relationships in school is currently very hierarchical. It's the teacher is sir, it's miss. It's not. That's a hierarchy that puts them higher than the pupil. You have to give them a certain amount of respect without that teacher actually having to necessarily gain your respect first. So there's quite a hierarchical system within our schools. Democratic schools, as an example, do things differently. They set things up much more horizontally? Yeah, horizontally, whereby all young people have a say in how the school is run. They have agency. They have decision making. They have some power to decide how their learning will take place. And that is incredibly powerful, because that sense of agency and that sense of being seen is and heard really does a lot of work, as we've been talking about, to make people feel valued, people feel worthy, people feel like they belong. So actually we're thinking about how we actually structure our schools in the first place and how we view those relationships is incredibly important. And like Sally said, a model around a non-punitive system. I strongly believe a non-punitive system that moves more towards restorative justice, focusing on conflict resolution, focusing on trust, focusing on rebuilding and repair of relationships, again, is really, really critical if we're going to not only create the conditions for young people to be able to learn, right? How can you sit down and learn if you feel rubbish about yourself? Like, how are you going to do that? I can't do that. I can't write and work if I'm feeling anxious. No. So why do we expect a 7-year-old to be able to do that? So I think this is a potential way to move towards what we might call a more inclusive education, where we're trying to meet the needs of young people, meet them where they are at, and also, of course, have a much more diverse kind of environment as well. So talking also about issues of race and gender, sexuality, all these kind of things as well, taking into consideration the ways in which these factors also are important to learning and making optimal conditions for our young people to learn, right? So yeah, that's kind of how I think inclusion in education might look like.
Yeah, absolutely. And then to bring it back to Andy and Mike, and thinking about their experiences, I think alternative provisions can still be part of an inclusive education. And ideally, they're not a one-way ticket. Like, to go to an AP doesn't mean you're never back in school. It means, like, if you're sick and you go to a hospital or whatever, it doesn't mean you don't go back to your normal life once you're well again. There's no reason why an alternative provision can't be a two-way thing. You go, you learn a little bit about this, that, and the other that helps you back onto your feet. You get some experiences, some care, and then you can come back. Like, if the communication between schools and APs is a community, it becomes part of a relationship that is providing all of the for all of the needs of our young people, then that's a resource that we can use safely and with a huge amount of trust and a huge amount of care and love and nurture, which these young people need. So, and that's something that Andy and Mike spoke very strongly that they received at their AP. So it is possible, and it is something that we should be building upon to provide space in where there isn't space, maybe in a mainstream classroom.
And finally, what are the ways in which the community outside of education could contribute towards improving the education system for all of its students? For me, I think, this is a really difficult question to answer. Because obviously, at the moment, I feel like I don't have answers. I have questions, and I feel like the investigating and answering those questions is important, but for the community too. But I would definitely like to see, like, the things that have arisen, like parents to not isolate students in the school playground. Like, when you're doing your invites, either do 1 or 2 students or do everybody. Don't leave one person out. Don't leave them off your Christmas list. Don't not say hello to that parent in the playground because they don't look like you. Not everyone has to be your best friend for you to be courteous, polite, and inclusive. And the same for teachers. I don't like it that I'm still hearing colleagues comment they say they can't afford school shoes, but they've got the latest phone, or things like, there's so many stereotypes that why should they come to the prom? They were so disruptive. Those are really unhelpful. So just being open-minded to listen to the experiences of these young people and validate their experiences without but you shouldn't have. Yeah, they shouldn't have. They know they shouldn't have. That's fine. Put that to one side for a moment and just listen, because we've got so much to learn and to gain from that too.
Yeah, and I think also, there's other as well as doing everything that Sally says, which I completely agree with, we could also support our striking teachers. So teachers are out on strike right now. And this is why, like everything we've been talking about in terms of the way the system is set up, it's not working. So yeah, you might not like it that your teacher's on strike and it's an inconvenience for you because your kid's at home today, but the reason is big. And one thing you could do to show that solidarity to your child is to show the solidarity to the teacher as well. And you can also show support. There's activist groups, there's community groups. A big one for exclusions is a group called No More Exclusions, who operate, I think it's in London and also in Manchester. They do a lot of community work. It's a Black-led organization, so it's a lot to do with racism as well that exists in the educational system. So, there are ways in which you could also just try to educate yourself, understand what's going on, and unlearn these stereotypes that we all carry, right? We all carry these stereotypes about what we imagine people to be like. So it starts with us, right? It starts within us to think differently, or try to at least start to question why things are the way they are. And is this the best way for us all?
Absolutely. Well, I have to say, that's it from us at Coffee and Cocktails with your host, Dr. Ann Wand. I'd like to thank Alison and Sally for joining us at the studio this afternoon. Additional information on today's topic, as well as a link to the documentary film with Mike and Andy, will be available on our website in the show notes. And if you enjoy the show, then consider becoming a patron starting at £1 per month. It's support from our patrons that really helps to keep the show going. By becoming a patron, you get access to extra bonus content, patron-only interviews, panels, workshops, and much more. To join, just head over to patreon.com/Coffee and Cocktails Podcast. Otherwise, that's it for now. Thanks for listening and have a great week.